The story begins with a quiet morning that felt heavier than most. The sun had barely risen, yet the world around Ramon Cruz felt unusually still, as if holding its breath for something only he could sense. He walked slowly toward the entrance of the AGT auditorium,
Please subscribe to our
carrying an old
channel.
guitar case and a heart filled with years of unspoken dreams. Ramon's footsteps were careful, almost hesitant, as though each step asked him whether this path was truly meant for him. He had spent most of his life in small Filipino plazas, singing for crowds who came not for fame or spectacle, but for the warmth of music. They remembered him not as a star, but as a gentle soul who sang Elvis songs with a sincerity that touched people deeply.
Please subscribe to our
Growing up in
channel.
a humble coastal town, Ramon never imagined his voice would reach far beyond the waves that crashed near his childhood home. Life had not been easy. There were days when music was the only thing that kept him standing. But through every hardship, he remained soft-spoken, kind, and grateful, qualities that made him loved by those who truly knew him. Beside him, unseen by the world, walked memories of long nights playing in open streets, of family sacrifices, of moments when he almost gave up. Yet here he was, stepping into a building filled with bright lights, cameras, and people who did not know his story, or the weight he carried silently within. As he reached the backstage area, Ramon paused. He felt the air change. This was not the familiar warmth of small-town gatherings. This was America's biggest stage, loud, overwhelming, and full of expectations. For a brief moment, he wondered if he truly belonged here. But beneath his nerves lived a courage shaped by years of quiet perseverance. He was not here to impress anyone. He was here to honor
Please
every
subscribe
person
to
who
our
believed
channel.
he deserved a moment to be seen. What he didn't know, what no one knew, was that this ordinary-looking man from the Philippines was just minutes away from shaking not only the stage, but the hearts of millions across America. Ramon stepped closer to the stage entrance, where the world suddenly felt too big, too bright, and too fast. The buzz of cameras, the murmur of the audience, the hum of the stage lights, everything blended into a blur he could barely hold steady in his thoughts. He breathed slowly, trying to calm the storm inside his chest. In a quiet corner backstage, his niece Leah watched him with trembling hands. She was young, but her eyes carried a depth shaped by years of watching her uncle work tirelessly, not only to survive, but to protect her after life had taken too much from their family. She believed in him more than he believed in himself, and it was her encouragement that had brought him all the way to America for this audition. Leah stood behind a curtain, clutching the pendant he had given her long ago. The weight of the moment pressed on her just as heavily as it pressed on him. She knew his voice wasn't just talent, it was a story of resilience, of long nights and unseen battles. And now, that story was about to be placed in front of thousands of eyes, and millions more across the world. As Ramon waited for his turn, he watched other performers pass by, some confident, some nervous, some desperate for a chance at fame. He felt different from all of them. Fame had never been his dream. All he ever wanted was to sing with honesty, to make people feel something real. Then, the stage assistant signaled him. A simple gesture. Yet it felt like the world had shifted beneath his feet. The crowd outside grew louder, and the judges took their seats, unaware that an unexpected whirlwind was about to walk into their lives. Ramon moved forward, each step slow, almost sacred. The stage doorway opened like a gateway to a moment he had never dared to imagine for himself. A strange quietness settled over him, not fear, not excitement, but a deep peace, as if every moment of struggle had led him right here. No one in the building knew it yet, but the silence before him was not emptiness. It was the calm before a storm that would shake America. Ramon stepped into the center of the stage, and the world around him transformed. The lights washed over his face, blurring everything except the quiet thump of his own heartbeat. Thousands of eyes stared at him from the darkness of the audience, yet he felt strangely alone, as if the world had fallen away, leaving only him and the memory of every moment that led here. The judges looked at him with polite curiosity, expecting another tribute singer, someone who loved Elvis, someone who tried to sound like him, maybe even someone who hoped nostalgia would carry them far. None of them imagined what was hidden behind Ramon's humble posture, his lowered shoulders, his gentle breath. Then, the music began. A soft instrumental filled the space, floating like morning mist across a silent field. Ramon closed his eyes, not to escape, but to return. To the streets of his small Filipino town. To the nights when he sang under flickering plaza lights. To the quiet applause of people who never had much, yet gave him everything they could, belief. When the first note left his lips, it wasn't loud. It wasn't forceful. It was warm, gentle enough to touch every corner of the room. The audience leaned forward without realizing it. A shift, subtle but undeniable, crept through the arena. Then his voice rose. Strong. Golden. Full of a depth that felt almost unreal. It echoed with years of unspoken battles, fears he had swallowed, dreams he had buried and revived countless times. The softness of Elvis's tone lived within him, but it wasn't imitation. It was rebirth, carried by the soul of a man who had endured more than he ever admitted. The judges froze. Not in shock, but in awe. Something about his voice held them captive, like time itself had paused to listen. The crowd erupted to their feet, yet Ramon continued singing with the same sincerity he once gave to small gatherings back home. Every note became a memory. Every breath became a prayer. Every rise in his voice felt like a man finally being heard by a world that had overlooked him for too long. And for the first time in his life, Ramon wasn't just singing. He was shaking America. Then his voice rose. Strong. Golden. Full of a depth that felt almost unreal. It echoed with years of unspoken battles, fears he had swallowed, dreams he had buried and revived countless times. The softness of Elvis's tone lived within him, but it wasn't imitation. It was rebirth, carried by the soul of a man who had endured more than he ever admitted. The judges froze. Not in shock, but in awe. Something about his voice held them captive, like time itself had paused to listen. The crowd erupted to their feet, yet Ramon continued singing with the same sincerity he once gave to small gatherings back home. Every note became a memory. Every breath became a prayer. Every rise in his voice felt like a man finally being heard by a world that had overlooked him for too long. And for the first time in his life, Ramon wasn't just singing. He was shaking America. Then his voice rose. Strong. Golden. Full of a depth that felt almost unreal. It echoed with years of unspoken battles, fears he had swallowed, dreams he had buried and revived countless times. The softness of Elvis's tone lived within him, but it wasn't imitation. It was rebirth, carried by the soul of a man who had endured more than he ever admitted. Ramon bowed his head, overwhelmed by everything happening around him. For years, struggle had been his companion. For years, music had been the one constant that never abandoned him. And now, on a stage he once feared he did not belong to, he stood embraced by the same world that had once felt unreachable. In a matter of minutes, his life had shifted. He wasn't just a humble singer from a distant town anymore. He had become a symbol of hope, a reminder that dreams, no matter how delayed, still had the power to find the light. His journey was no longer just his own. It had become a moment shared with millions. Ramon's audition spread across the world long before he even left the stage that day. Within hours, the performance reached phones, televisions, and laptops in places he had never imagined. People watched not because he looked like Elvis, but because he carried something deeper, a quiet, humble fire that reminded them of what music once meant. Clips of his golden voice traveled from one state to another, across oceans, across borders. Families played it during dinner. Strangers shared it with friends. Elderly couples smiled with watery eyes. Children tried to imitate his tone, unaware of how many years of struggle hid behind every note he had released. Back home in the Philippines, neighbors gathered around old televisions and small phone screens. They recognized the man who once sang for free at local events, the man who fixed his own guitar strings because he couldn't afford new ones, the man who always gave more than he had. Now, the world was giving back to him. Leah stood beside Ramon as messages flooded his phone, messages from people saying they felt hope again, that his voice reminded them of better days, that his performance healed something inside them. She watched her uncle's eyes soften with each notification. He didn't chase fame. Fame had simply found the sincerity that lived in him all along. In the days that followed, news outlets called him the Filipino Elvis, but those who connected with his story knew he was something more. He was proof that greatness didn't always come from wealth, perfection, or perfect timing. Sometimes, it came from a quiet man who refused to let life harden him. Ramon continued singing not for spotlight or success, but for the same reason he always had, to make people feel less alone. His voice became a reminder that dreams could rise from the smallest places, even from a humble town thousands of miles away from America's biggest stage. And though he never asked for recognition, he became a symbol of it, proof that a heart full of humility can shake the world more powerfully than any spotlight ever could. In the end, Ramon didn't just change his life. He touched the lives of millions, one golden note at a time. When Eli's final note faded into the vastness of the theater, the silence that followed felt unreal, like the entire world had paused on a single breath. It hung in the air, delicate and trembling, as though even the walls themselves needed a moment to understand what had just happened. Mira and Eli stood frozen at the center of the stage, their bodies still shaped by the emotion of the song, their chests rising and falling with the weight of everything they'd poured into that performance. Then, something extraordinary happened. The silence broke, not with noise, but with emotion. A wave of breath swept through the audience as people finally exhaled, many with trembling hands covering their mouths, others wiping tears that had fallen without their permission. The siblings couldn't see individual faces clearly through the lights, but they could feel it. The shift. The warmth. The awe. It washed over them like a tide, soft yet overwhelming. The judges rose from their seats, one by one, creating a ripple of movement that transformed the entire theater. Their expressions carried something deeper than surprise. It was the kind of look reserved for moments that could not be explained, only felt. Moments where raw humanity touched something holy. Moments where talent and heart collided in a way that left the world changed. On stage, Eli's legs trembled. His hands shook at his sides. The note he had released still echoed inside his chest, but now it shared space with something new, relief, disbelief, and a quiet, powerful pride. He turned slightly, his eyes searching for Myra's presence. She stood beside him, tears shimmering on her lashes, her shoulders rising with a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. The warmth of the lights reflected off her expression, revealing a joy so pure it almost hurt. Together, they stepped forward, unsure but guided by instinct, as applause thundered through the room. It grew louder with each passing second, an eruption of sound so powerful it seemed to shake the air itself. People rose to their feet, some clapping, some crying, some simply staring as if they had witnessed something impossible. For the first time in their lives, Mira and Eli felt the world looking at them not with pity, but with admiration. Not with concern, but with wonder. In that moment, under the brightest lights they had ever known, the siblings realized something they had never dared to believe. Their story wasn't just theirs anymore. It now belonged to everyone who had just witnessed a miracle.